I run something called the Society of Writers in the Wild, kind of half based in France now and half based in Devon with that. And we run courses called the Writer in the Wild courses. So my work really is all about bringing a kind of fusion of psychotherapy and creative writing teaching and my own experience of the writing process into these workshops. And they're very much body-based, nature-based workshops. So what I'm trying to bring to writers is a slightly new approach, which is about how to work with the whole of your being and your body in the writing process, and also how to bring our experience of nature into that. So in my work, nature isn't just an inspiration for what I do, it's also very much about the animal inside of us and the wild qualities inside of us as well. And I work with novice writers and with professional writers, and I work with non-fiction writers, poetry writers, fiction writers. It's not just about autobiographical writing what I do, as I'll explain a little bit later on in terms of how we use metaphor and the healing process in terms of writing. But I'm inspired by all sorts of people in that. Obviously, there's a great tradition of nature writing, and I think Chris and I were talking about Roger Deakin earlier, but there's a wonderful tradition of people who have been inspired recently to write about their experiences of nature and how nature informs our psyche and our lives. I'm also a big fan of some of the nature poetry, the nature poets such as Mary Oliver, who's a big inspiration for me as well. And if anything, I come more from a sort of psychotherapeutic tradition than I come from a fiction or a non-fiction tradition in terms of my inspirations. So I work very much from a Gestalt point of view in my work. I also use the work of Peter Levine and somatic experiencing very much. He works a lot with a sense of how we can release energy from our bodies. And for me, that's very akin to the creative process. So I work a lot with the work of Peter Levine. And also Eugene Gendlin, who coined the term felt sense, is very relevant to my work. He talks very much about using our gut instinct and using our holistic sense of who we are in terms of how we function in our lives. And what I've tried to do in my work is to extend these ideas into the writing process particularly, because many of these ideas are familiar to people who have been in therapy, and they're also many of the kind of writing techniques are familiar to people who've been to creative writing courses. But what I find is that there are aspects that are unfamiliar that I can sort of transpose into the different realms to bring a kind of new experience to writers of how to work with their creative process and to work with the problems that they encounter when they sit down to write. The Writer in the Wild course is a pioneering approach to working in a psychological, body-based and nature-based way with writers, and that's some people doing a workshop. So you see most of our workshops, like the one I'll be doing here, most of our workshops are based, when I can, they're based outside in the outdoor environment, in nature. So what do we mean by wild? So I talk so much about wild words and writer in the wild, and it's important, I think, to define what I mean by wild, because wild is quite a broad term, and it's used in different ways by different people. So when I talk about wild, I mean spontaneous, expressive, intuitive, instinctual. I also mean flowing. Flowing is a big thing because writers talk a lot about block and flow. So I use the word flow a lot in terms of how I define wild in my work. People come to my workshops and they always feel they have to write things that are big and loud and emotional and expressive and quite aggressive sometimes, because that's their perception of what wild is. And actually, this is not how I would define wild. I would define wild as being in touch with your instinctual nature or your intuitive nature. And that's quite different from our ideas of wild as crazy or out of control or nuts or mad or any of those things. And it may be that if you come to a Writers in the Wild workshop, it may be that your words come out very big and loud and aggressive and angry, and there's no problem with that at all if that's coming from the kind of an authentic place in terms of how you want to communicate. But that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes wild words can come out really small, really small and really quiet and really friendly. They don't have to be this big kind of lion effect. And I think sometimes we corrupt the word wild. We corrupt it into the idea of crazy, whereas actually, in the wild, animals are very receptive and very, very sensitive to their environment, and they act very much in tune with their environment. So there's a sense of connection in terms of how they relate to their environment and to their core being. And what I'm encouraging in the Wild Words courses is that sense of connection, not of disconnection. So you see there's a subtle difference between crazy and wild for me that's very important. So what the next question really then is, what does it mean to write from a place of wild? What does that mean? And if you think about, firstly, I think it's helpful to use that metaphor of an animal in nature and how a wild animal functions in nature. An animal first uses all of its senses to pick up stimuli from the environment, doesn't it? So it uses its eyes to see what it can see, and its smell, sense of smell, its nose, it uses its ears to hear. It uses its sense of taste. It uses its body sensations, its sense of what's experiencing in its body, whether it's contraction or expansion or a sense of heat, a sense of cold, a sense of vibration. It uses all these things to pick up what's going on around it. And it's confronted by various opportunities and various threats. And as soon as it sees or it experiences a threat or an opportunity, it goes into a place of activation in its body. So its heart rate picks up, its pulse picks up, blood moves away from its core and into its legs so that it's ready for fight or flight response to what's going on. So you see all these reactions, these very physical reactions going on, and this great surge of energy, this great preparation as energy is stored, ready for the attack or for the flight. And the animal will then act on that. And in the act of attacking or the act of fleeing, that energy is discharged from the nervous system. So what you see is a kind of an arc, and it's interesting that this arc is kind of similar to what we think of as a narrative arc when we write as well. But you see this arc of activation, and then the discharge, and energy is discharged. That's a healthy way to function. And my suggestion in my Wild Words work is that actually, given the right environment, and given a sensitivity to the whole of our being, to our body as well as our mind, if we have that, then we function the same way. We also go into activation as we face an opportunity or a threat, and we also discharge energy in the same way. Take an example of, I don't know, so you're sitting down writing one day and you've set aside a very precious hour which is going to give you time to do this writing you've been trying to do for months, and it's like it's your space, it's your really precious time. And then the phone rings. Right, so you have an option. So to function in a healthy way with regard to that, what might be a threat to your writing process, if you function in a healthy way, you then choose either to ignore the phone, because you're in the middle of your process and that's your proactive choice, or you choose to answer the phone, one or the other. Those are both healthy responses, and what happens then is that in answering it or in choosing to ignore it, you let go of that activation, you come back into a place of relaxation because you've dealt with it. And you've dealt with it in a way that is proactive and is not helpless. It's a proactive choice, and you've made your choice and you act on it, and that's great. What can sometimes happen is that instead of doing that, the phone rings and we go into a kind of a freeze, and it's like, oh no, this is my precious hour, I'm meant to be writing, what should I do, what if it's my mother, she's going to say she's ill again, I don't want to answer it because I have to speak to her for an hour, but then what if she's really ill, and you go into this whole cycle of kind of, of doubts and of trying to second guess yourself. So in that, we get kind of stuck, and I'm going to talk a little bit later a bit more about that, about why we get stuck. But just to come back to the idea that we have a natural way of functioning that just works. If we don't tread on our own toes, basically. We are natural storytellers. If you ever go to a pub and you hear someone drunk kind of giving this great oration about their life, it can be absolutely riveting. Not always, but sometimes it can be riveting. Sometimes it can be this amazing anecdote which rises to a beautiful climax and to a lovely denouement afterwards. Think of another example. Something happens to you in the day and you rush off in the evening to tell your best mate about it. And oh, this happened to me today, and oh, it was terrible, oh, what am I going to do? And you also, if you ever observe, it's hard to observe it if you're doing it yourself, but if you observe somebody else going through that process, you'll see that they tell a lovely story. It's a beautiful story. It finds its own shape, it finds its own structure, it finds its own arc. So I have a real belief that we are natural storytellers. And we don't always know the reason that we tell stories. there can be a tendency in psychotherapy to try and pinpoint the source of issues that we have in our life or issues that we have in our writing. In terms of how I work with wild words, it's not necessarily to know the source of the story we need to tell, but it's just to have a trust, I suppose, that we have a natural capacity to tell stories, and that we tell stories for a reason. We do it to process emotion, to process energy, to communicate, to exchange ideas. We do it because we need to do it to survive, and we need to do it to thrive. It's not an extra, it's not a luxury. So my first task in Wild Words is always to try and bring people back to a sense of trust in their own experience and their own ability to tell stories. And that if we stop getting in the way of that process which is a natural coming back to equilibrium of our being, and a natural process of creating narrative and creating story, then it will do itself. It's about having the trust in that process, and the trust to enable that process. So, having said all that, I wanted to talk about what gets in the way of this wonderful theoretical idea that we are natural storytellers and we have this great wellspring of inspiration that will just manifest beautifully on the page. And I think most of us know, who are writers, at certain periods in our lives, we can do that thing of telling great stories to our mates, or we can have an awareness that we are full of stories. But sometimes, when we come and sit down in front of that blank page, we just freeze up. We find that the stories aren't there anymore. We find we can't think. Everybody knows, if not from their writing, everybody knows from their life experience that sense of freezing up. And we experience it all the time, but it can become a major, major problem for writers at certain periods in their lives and in their careers. And the basic reason, I think, for this block, if we have to use a shorthand for it, would be that we think too much. And instead of using our thinking minds to make careful, proactive decisions, and instead of using them in a way that communicates with our bodily experience as well, what we tend to do is get stuck in great loops of thinking. Okay, so my example of that telephone call that arrives when you're writing is an example of that. So instead of just saying, I'll answer the phone and answering it, or instead of just saying, I'll leave it this time because I'm a bit busy, we get into this kind of loop of, shall I answer it, shall I not? We start to have doubts about our decisions, we start to second think ourselves and second guess, and round and round and round we go in this very kind of what we call a very head-based place, really, a very kind of rational mind loop. So our natural ability to come into a physical activation and then to discharge that energy, we cut it off. Yeah, we don't fulfil what would be a natural kind of process of discharge, a natural process of coming back to equilibrium for our bodies and for our minds. There's a real problem with thinking, and the basis of Wild Words work is to help writers to rediscover a way of writing that is, that the source of which is as much the body and our whole sense experience as it is the mind. And this is often fairly unfamiliar territory for writers. I know for myself that I come from quite an intellectual place. In terms of my history, in terms of learning to write, I like to read. There's a lot of ideas in my head. We all, as writers, use words, and using words, of course, is the first thing that's going to send us shooting up into our heads, because that feels like a very mental process, and a purely mental process sometimes to us. But actually, so much more authenticity and so much more flow can come if we use the whole of ourselves when we write. And not just that head-based place. So, can you see the quotes? There are little quotes here. I haven't been reading them out, but they're really nice. I don't know if you can. I hope you can see them. No? Okay, I'll start reading out some of them, because this quote is Maya Angelou, and she's saying, "There is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you," which I think is lovely. Yeah, okay. So having said that Wild Words it's about body and it's about nature, I want to talk a little bit about those two elements which are really fundamental. And I touched on them already, but I'd like to just expand a little bit on that. So just to talk, to talk about the role of the body a little more. So there are two levels on which I think that the body is important in writing. And I think one level is easier to accept for many people than the other level. And I hope that this talk will help you to accept both of those levels. But to start with the kind of the more writing technique kind of level, I believe that it's very difficult to write about something that we haven't experienced. Now, this is true if we're a fiction writer or a non-fiction writer or a poetry writer. And I'm not, if I say that, I'm not talking about events or specific characters or specific places. That's kind of a different thing. We can invent those, I think. We can largely transpose experience onto realms, onto places and specific areas that we're unfamiliar with. What I'm talking about when I say that is emotional experience, particularly, and physical experience, a sense of how it is to be in a human body. So, there's a nice quote here, actually, for those of you who can't see it. It says, "Writing starts with living." Writing starts with living. And I really believe that. I believe that the broader our experience of our lives and the deeper our experience of our lives, the more we will be able to bring a depth and a breadth and an aliveness into not only our lives, but into our writing on the page. So there's a direct through line, I believe, between the writer and the character or narrator as you present them on the page, and the reader. As the writer, we feel an emotion, and we then put that onto the character. We give that to the character or the narrator, who's the subject of what we're writing, who's central to what we're writing. And that feeling, that emotion, that bodily sense is then picked up by the reader. So for me, there's a very direct line between our own personal experience and what ends up on the page. And I don't feel that that's any less true of fiction than of factual writing. For me, we're metaphorical creatures as human beings. We conceptualize our world in terms of metaphor. Virtually everything we describe, everything we think is structured in terms of metaphor. We use more solid realms of experience to describe more abstract realms of experience, okay? Everything is a symbol of our own personal experience, and in a way, how can it not be? So the starting point for our writing, whether it's fiction or whether it's non-fiction, must be to be very grounded in our own experience and to have this very broad experience of our own lives before we can put that onto the page. And I personally believe, although some writers struggle with this, and I also hear often very reasonable arguments against this, and it's a process for me of really thinking about this, but my own belief is that all the stories we tell, whether they are fiction or non-fiction or poetry, all the stories we tell are that way of processing energy. So I often say to writers, what's the story you really want to tell? And I then explore with them how it is to drop down into a kind of whole body sense of what that might be, rather than just staying in their minds and coming up with the kind of first automatic answer to that. But I don't want to be misunderstood in that, because the story that we need to tell is not always a literal story. It can be just a story of something physical, something emotional that needs to discharge, an energy that needs to discharge. And the story that we need to tell is not always the same, and it's not consistent, and it's not static. So the story we need to tell one day is not the same as the story we need to tell tomorrow, or the story we need to tell next year, or the story that we need to tell in 5 years' time. We're organic, shifting creatures, and the way that we need to express ourselves in symbols will change. So just to understand that I'm not necessarily working on a kind of a level of so if I ask a question in a workshop, I say, well, what's the story you need to tell? Someone might say, oh, Or I'm sure it's about my mother, and it's about the day I was traumatised by she did this, you know, that sort of stuff. And that may be absolutely, there's no reason why that wouldn't be a completely valid story and an important story for you to tell at that point. But when I talk about the story you need to tell, I'm talking really about a deeper sense of what that is, I suppose. Okay, so I was talking about the role of the body, and I was saying that there's this through line between the writer and the character, or the narrator, and the reader. And the other level on which the role of the body is really important is slightly more subtle, and it just comes back to our holistic sense of what we are and who we are. And there's a man called Eugene Gendlin. I don't know if anyone is familiar with his work on focusing. He uses a practice called focusing, which is great. But he works very much with this idea of our felt sense, which includes is really our experience of how it is to be in this body. And it can be a very intangible experience. It can be a very ungraspable experience. You know, it's not always clear. We can have just a sense of something that needs to be said, or a sense of an unease, and it can be a fairly kind of generalised bodily sense. But it's very important that we also listen to that, because that holds a great deal of wisdom and knowledge, and yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that's really important for us to access when we're writing. So that we're not just using that head level, that intellectual level that we can be used to utilising more often, I think. So yeah, so that's the felt sense. And if anyone wants to come to the workshop later on, then we'll be exploring a little more how that feels to be in contact with that, and how we can connect that in a very specific, practical way to our experience of writing. So, Wild Words work. So I've talked really about the importance of storytelling, I think, a little bit already, and of metaphor, perhaps. And again, metaphor is a huge subject. It's one of my favourite subjects, but it's complex. So again, we'll go into that a little bit more on the workshop. But just to understand that as human beings, our initial experience as small children is through our body. And we tend to conceptualise everything after that in terms of our bodily experience, okay? And we start with a very physical sense of what something is, and they then abstract it. So to give you an example of the idea of love, love is a concept that it's quite hard to grasp without comparing it to something else. So in general, when we talk about love in our writing, or even in our language, which obviously is kind of the same thing, they're a reflection of each other, we nearly always use metaphor to describe love. Love is nearly always compared to something else, like love is a journey, or love is a battle, or love is a path. So you can see from this that we're always having to use less abstract ways of talking about something in order to convey more abstract terms and ideas, which often include emotions. And this is an interesting subject to explore for writers, about how we get those more abstract emotions and how we pin them down on the page, because it's not easy, because they're not, we need to grasp them, we need to show them to the writer. So that's the power of storytelling and metaphor. And my central metaphor in Wild Words is the idea that we want to try and re-find a place of instinctual, a place of the instinctual and the intuitive. We want to re-find the animal part of ourselves. And if sometimes people hear the word animal and they get kind of a bit scared about that, because it ties in with them with all those ideas of wildness and danger, and we have this fundamental fear of being out of control, this part of ourselves that is not necessarily in our control. And on Wild Words, I'm not just talking about letting that all out. I don't work in that cathartic way. I don't believe that is the best way to work, either in terms of therapeutic work or in terms of writing and helping writers. What we're talking about is getting in touch with an equilibrium and a healthy way of functioning and an in-tuneness. So the path to doing that, I feel, is very similar to the path of tracking a wild animal. And the skills that we need as writers to re-find our natural storyteller, or to find the story that we really need to tell, the path is very similar to the path that we would use to track our animal. The skills are very similar to the skills that we would need to learn if we were going to track a wild animal. And so in workshops I take people through a very specific process of skills that we need to learn to track our wild words. And it's fun, it's outdoors, and it's quite fun to engage with that as well, I think, for people.
And as I said, it's not about catharsis exactly, although expression kind of, a sort of sense of letting everything out can be very helpful for people. It's often very helpful for people. But an important part of my work is also to explain to people that that's not the end of the process. If you do that as a writer, often you end up with a mass of stuff and your novel is 3 times as long as you thought it was, and oh dear, and how am I going to get it down, and I was writing about that and I went off track, oops, and all that stuff happens. So we also need to find a way of harnessing our words, of building a relationship with that wild animal, building a relationship with our wild words, our wild expression, in order to bring it into a kind of a form on the page and a satisfactory read for the person who's going to read it. There's a quote I'd like to read, which begins just on the bottom of here, but I have it on the next slide. I'd like to read it because I really like it, and I think it sums up quite a lot of what I'm saying. So, Catherine Mansfield. It's a quote by Catherine Mansfield. "The mind I love most must have wild places, a tangled orchard where dark damsons drop in the heavy grass, an overgrown little wood, the chance of a snake or two, a pool that nobody fathomed the depths of, and paths threaded with flowers planted by the mind." And so I really like that, because Wild Words is so much about all of that. It's so much about an inner exploration, but an inner exploration that is incredibly connected with our environment and with our relationship to our world. That connection between the writer and their words and the world, and how those things interweave and thread together. So I very much like that quote. So the other thing that's very important in Wild Words work is the role of nature. Nature is our model and our inspiration in terms of the work that we do at Wild Words. Qualities of wild are very accessible indoors as well as outdoors. I don't want people to feel that they can't take part in Wild Words work because they don't have access to nature or access to the outdoors. I sometimes have students who've been in prison and they don't have much access to the outdoors. I've also had people work with me who are housebound for various reasons to do with illness. And what we found is that there's many connections you can make with the wild, even indoors. If you think about the grain of wood on the table, the quality of movement that's held in that wood, just by watching the patterns of its growth as they've been fixed in your dining room table, for example, or just watching the quality of the water as it comes down from the shower. These things are... We're connected all the time to nature. The way that wind moves through the house, the way that air moves across your face. We can find a connection wherever we are. It's important. And the other thing is that it's not necessary to live in the country to take part in work that involves Wild Words. In many ways, it's even more fascinating to look at qualities of wild as they manifest in cities. If you look at the way that the strength and the resilience of plants that they push their way out through walls and out through paving stones, it's really beautiful to see. And the clouds overhead, all of that stuff, it's all there in the city as well. And cities are also, I'm going to talk about how we project our shadow onto the environment in a moment. But cities are very interesting in terms of looking at people who we naturally would stay right away from, who we might consider a bit mad, a bit unpredictable, a bit crazy. It's very interesting to look at qualities of ourselves that we're disowning and we're putting into somebody else. I'm going to say a bit more about that in a minute. But certainly cities have they're a wonderful source of wildness, and they're if anything, the contrast with the man-made setting, between the man-made setting and the wildness is more vivid in the city. So I like to do workshops in cities as well around Wild Words. They work really well. But certainly, if we have a choice, it's better to go outside and make immediate, direct contact with nature rather than stay in our room. William Wordsworth. Come forth into the light of things, let nature be your teacher. I like that one too. That's quite a famous one. Probably most of you have heard that at some point. Come forth into the light of things, let nature be your teacher. And that's very much what we're doing, very much what we're doing at Wild Words. So the reason is, two reasons really that I like people to come on workshops that involve being outdoors. The first one is that nature is a fantastic place in which to face our fears. If you think of the language that we use about nature, we talk about going into the wilds, into the wilderness. It's quite negative, really. You know, we have a sort of, if I just say those words, often people think, oh, you know, that's a bit scary, that's a bit nerve-wracking. Going into the unknown, that's all a bit, you know, it's a bit dangerous, perhaps. So it's very interesting to look at which qualities we say are out there rather than in here, you know. If all those qualities are out there, they're not in here, we disown them. And it's interesting, isn't it? It's like if all the wildness is out there and we're not in touch within ourselves, then how can we bring it into our own writing? So the process really is of observing which things we've cut off from in our own experience and retaking those before we then imbue our words with those qualities. The exterior world, the outer landscape, always reflects our internal landscape, our internal world. So it's like we're looking through a mirror. We're using nature here as a mirror to see how we function, to realise a bit more how we function. I do exercises sometimes just where I ask people to walk around and to notice which things attract your attention and which things do you just want to run away from. You know, it's very interesting. It's like, oh, that lovely glowing sunset is rather appealing. Oh, but that scary big wave isn't. And yeah, just to notice, what are the qualities? What are the things that appeal to you, and which are the things that just think, oh, I don't want to go near that, and to work with finding a kind of a steady distance, a steady way of making contact with all the qualities of our environment and all the qualities that we hold within ourselves. Because writing is so much about making contact with an experience of our character or our narrator, and that's, if we can keep a steady contact, either with our subject as we observe it, if we're sitting literally writing in nature, or with our emotional experience as we remember something, if the process is more an indoors sitting at our desk kind of process. If we can keep in contact with our emotional experience, then we write vividly, beautifully richly, and with beautiful depth. And if I read someone's work, it's usually very clear to me when they've managed to stay in contact with the experience and when something has sent them spinning off. You know, when something they were writing about was too scary, that they couldn't stay with it experientially. And when that happens, what I see is that there's a big dramatic scene and suddenly they cut out of it, or they summarise parts of a story where actually I feel they should be just going forwards into more depth about it. So it's very interesting. It's a process of making contact, always about making contact with our inner experience. So facing our fears is a really good reason to connect with nature. The other reason is just that nature is incredibly resourcing, I think, and incredibly nourishing to be in contact with. And it's something that in our modern lives we don't always feel that we have time or space to make a connection with. So whenever I can encourage that, I do that. If in my psychotherapy practice, if I have a client who's traumatised, it's a general word, but traumatised in some way, the first thing I will always do is ask them to come back to their sensory experience, to come back to what they can see, what they can smell, any tastes, any sounds, and what they touch, what colour is the sofa that they're sitting on, how do their feet feel on the floor. And the reason to do this is that coming back to our sensory experience lowers our fear, always. So as writers also, if we get caught up in fears around our process of writing, doubts about our validity as writers, or our doubts about our ability to express, the first thing always to do is come back to your sensory experience. And being outside in nature is brilliant for that, because it's so evocative, it's so in your face, the colours, the sounds, the sights, it immediately brings us back, immediately grounds us. And what better place, what better thing to do than to enjoy a connection with nature and watch that beautiful sunset and watch the clouds pass overhead. It's a wonderful thing to do. There's a quote by E. Cummings. "The world is mud luscious and puddle wonderful, And I think that's beautiful, because the world is mud-luscious and puddle-wonderful. His creativity, his flexibility with words is so beautiful, and I really get the sense of the kind of playfulness that you know, in our experience of our engagement with nature and that. Okay, so this talk has been entitled Passion for the Wild, and just to summarise, my passion really is about helping writers to connect with the wild inside themselves, and how that manifests in the external world and in their writing. And there's nothing as satisfying as helping and enabling someone to find the story that they want to tell, whatever that means to them. And then the next stage is getting that down onto the page and harnessing that on the page, and that's also a wonderful thing. If you think about a process of building a relationship with a young horse, for example, you know, or a child, you know, the balance between protecting and supporting, and also bringing a kind of quite a steady container to your relationship with them. It's no different with our words, and that process of both enabling and of containing and harnessing, you know, they go together, and it's a very beautiful process to be involved in. Yeah, that's wild words. Thank you.